Good afternoon, everyone. I am Deborah Richardson with the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, and we want to first thank the State Bar of Georgia and the Law Day Committee for allowing the center to once again to be a part of the planning and implementation of this important program. As many of you know, the center is currently under construction in downtown Atlanta, just a few blocks from here, between the World of Coke and the Georgia Aquarium. It will be open in June of 2014, so we hope that you will join us there for our opening events as well as programming such as this that we will offer on the center on an ongoing basis. This particular topic is of particular interest to the center because it directly connects with our mission, and that is how do we inform the citizenry so that they will be inspired to action. And you will see and hear from the panelists as part of today's conversation exactly how you can spark that engagement. And we hope the messages that we will hear, that you will go out and continue to talk about it in the community in your own circles. So it gives me much delight to introduce to you to our moderator, who is a partner with the center in a lot of the work that we do. Dr. Yolande Tomlinson is the National Education Coordinator of the United States Human Rights Network. Yolande.
Welcome to this panel, Challenges of Maintaining Democracy. Just to sort of remind you of the purpose of this panel, which is to explore the various challenges that nations face in maintaining democratic governments. Our panelists today will discuss it from three critical perspectives, and specifically how you maintain democracy. Those would be the recognition of human rights, fair and open elections, and the freedom of the press. So we will also discuss this within a global context, but also looking at the US in a comparative case. I don't have to remind you, but as you've been exploring throughout the day, the sort of critical importance of this topic, given the recent Supreme Court decision regarding the Voting Rights Act, both the WikiLeaks as well as the NSA surveillance incidents, the ongoing denial and suppression of human rights across our country in a variety of areas, be that public education, food access, fair and secure housing, access to health care, and I don't mean health insurance, I mean health care, and many other areas that impact our ability to freely and fairly participate in the democratic process. So just an outline of how we plan to proceed. I will go through and introduce our illustrious panel. We have some impressive speakers here today. After that, each speaker will take about 5 or 7 minutes to talk specifically about the issue from their respective issue area expertise. And then we'll get into a collective conversation and then open up for questions from you. So our 4 speakers, the first of whom I encourage you to read their longer bios, very enviable bios in the program. So I'll just introduce them by name and title and organization. Our first is Sarah Johnson, who is the Assistant Director of the Democracy Program at the Carter Center. Michael O'Reilly, who is the Deputy Executive Director for International Coordination and Member Advocacy at Amnesty International. Cynthia Tucker, who's a visiting professor, the Charlene Hunter Gall Distinguished Writer in Residence at the University of Georgia, and David Vigilante, what an awesome name, Senior Vice President Legal at CNN and Senior Vice President and Associate General Counsel of Turner Broadcasting System. So my first question to each of you, and we'll just go in order here, answering that is, how does your specific area of expertise, be that voting and elections, freedom of the press, and human rights, play a role in protecting the integrity of a democratic government? And if you will, compare and contrast these aspects in the US versus international.
Sure. Thank you, Yolanda. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Good morning, or good afternoon. Nice to be here. Thank you for that introduction. I am Sarah Johnson. I'm from, as you said, I'm an assistant director at the Carter Center, and I'd like to speak a little bit about the role of the Carter Center in terms of helping to protect the integrity of a democratic government. As you may or may not know, the center is very active, mostly overseas. In my particular role within the center is working to manage our election observation missions and long-term political monitoring. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that actually means. The Carter Center has observed elections in 38 different countries over about 30 years. We're approaching our 100th election observed. We've observed 96 elections, and several different locations, mostly Africa, the Middle East, and North Africa, Latin America, and in some countries in Asia. Election observation is a longer, it started out as maybe a very short 2 or 3 week period of observing just the lead up to the polls, and we've now come to understand over several years of conducting this type of work that the actual human rights and democratic elections have a much larger basis and a much longer timeline feeding into whether or not an election is actually genuine and whether or not that election represents the will of the people. So we take a much longer approach and are often deploy observers and a team of people to a country over 6 to 9 months or maybe even a year or two before an election to start observing. And by observation, I mean a systematic observation of the legal framework that governs elections and political participation, as well as the implementation of the election administration and how much the laws are in alignment with a country's international obligations for political and civil rights, as well as the implementation and how transparent the election is being implemented and whether or not it actually is being implemented as per the law. So typically we have anywhere from 10 to 150 people at any given time during an election observation. A much smaller core team over the several months before an election, but maybe a much larger group of people that come during the actual polling and voting itself to watch the polling procedures and counting procedures. But they are collecting data and making their assessments, and all of these assessments are fed back into our assessment of the election, which is very much grounded in human rights law and international public law. So when we make an assessment of an election overseas, we're looking at what sort of obligations the state has signed up to in terms of its own international commitments, and either in international treaty laws or via its membership in the UN, for example, with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights through the UN, or the Universal Human Rights Declaration. Treaties such as CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. When we look at the principles that are outlined in those treaties, and then interpretive sources that speak to how those principles can be actually implemented on the ground and how you actualize those principles. We look at several different areas, ones that you might expect in terms of political and civil rights participation, freedom of association, freedom of speech, the right to run as a candidate or the right to vote in an election, freedom of assembly, but also some that you might not think of immediately or might not come to mind immediately. The right to an appeal, for example, if any of those other rights that I mentioned are trampled on, that you would have the right to appeal for your particular case and have a timely and effective remedy to your appeal. And or security of the person, whether or not the environment in which an election is taking place allows for candidates to campaign, people to actively demonstrate against or for a position, and whether or not they feel safe enough even on election day to come out and cast a ballot. Can range anywhere from the conditions here in the U.S., which may be perfectly fine in terms of casting your ballot, to the situation in Afghanistan, where they had the presidential elections, and there was question as to whether or not what voter turnout would be based on the security environment in which people were participating in the election. So the Carter Center makes their observations, makes assessments, and offers recommendations as to how a country or an election commission might be able to implement its elections in line with those obligations. We publish very frequently public statements, and in a role similar to the press, try to create, by virtue of putting an assessment and information out into the public sphere, a level of accountability on public officials to be able to consider the recommendations, whether or not they find them to be useful, to implement them, and to create some public pressure and to inform key stakeholders. So to inform people who, civil society activists or legislatures or what exactly, what our assessments have been, what our recommendations are, and whether or not they should be, whether or not they should be taken into account. One interesting point, I guess, is in terms of, I can give a couple examples in terms of the international context, and that is, I think the U.S. is also equally bound by the international obligations by virtue of its own treaty obligations. We also here in the U.S. have international observers that come and observe our elections. We're part of the membership organization of the the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and by virtue of that, we have agreed to invite observers to come to the U.S. I think there's some misunderstandings in terms of who exactly has invited the observers to come and what kinds of access that they're allowed here in the U.S. Recently, the State House in Tennessee put a law before the governor to sign that would bar observers from coming to observe the elections, and I think there's some misunderstanding and awareness campaigns that need to be undertaken in terms of how the U.S. meets its own obligations in these regards. But the Carter Center itself is not involved here in the U.S. because we are headed by former President Carter, and as such don't consider that we consider that we might be perceived as a non-neutral actor in terms of an election observation, and it's very important to us in our work that we are neutral and non-biased and do not take a position on either side in an election. So we do not actively observe here in the U.S. except for instances where we've been invited to observe in Native American elections. But I think the work that we do is equally applicable. And most recently, we've been involved in Egypt, Sudan, Tunisia, the Palestinian territories, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and in several other places that I can talk about a little bit more if time allows later.
No, thank you, Sarah. And Michael, if you could speak to how your particular area expertise works to ensure the integrity of the democratic process.
Thank you, Yulan, and good afternoon, all. Any society that aspires to build or sustain a thriving democracy must first ensure that all of the people of that society may exercise their basic human rights. Political pluralism is predicated upon the ability of individuals to assemble, to associate with one another, to hold and to share views that may be at odds with those of the ruling power. Governments that don't safeguard these rights create an environment that promotes repression, not freedom. What is a democracy? There is actually no common definition of a democracy, and in the absence of a common definition, many institutions have formulated their own articulations of what a democracy is. I think that when we talk about democracy, it's just important for us to know that they don't all look alike or act alike. For Amnesty International, it may surprise some to know that we actually don't take a position on democracy per se as a form of government. Indeed, we take no position on ideologies of any kind, and instead, we focus our efforts on ensuring that governments live up to their obligations under the international human rights framework. That framework is based upon the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as Sarah mentioned, and the legally binding treaties that have arisen from the declaration, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. a democratic form of government often provides an environment that is more conducive for people to freely exercise their rights. But it is respect for human rights more broadly that secures the space for legitimate discourse and dissent. One thing we do know for sure is that having the word democratic in the name of your country is no guarantee of performance. I think we can see that with the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, more commonly known as North Korea. North Korea, if you didn't catch the news, held elections last month, and there was an impressive turnout. 100% of the eligible voters delivered 100% of the votes to the ruling party of Kim Jong-un. Now, bear in mind, of course, that voting is mandatory in North Korea, and that Amnesty International has documented that the government of North Korea is currently imprisoning hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children, many of them detained simply because of their association with someone the government has deemed to be guilty of a political crime. So, viewed in that light, the outcome of the elections in March, come as no surprise to anyone, and the government's near total suppression of all rights would certainly point to North Korea not being in the move toward thriving democracy anytime in the near future. What about a country in transition like Egypt? Following decades of rule by Hosni Mubarak, Egypt tasted political plurality with the elections of 2012. That was short-lived when the results of that election were overturned by the military when it assumed power a year later. Now the current government employs a wide range of methods to ensure that it holds control over the rights of the people and that it quashes all forms of dissent. If the government does not change course and begin to respect the rule of law, the situation in Egypt will continue to deteriorate, and the prospects for any kind of true democratic transition in that country will also seem far off. Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights begins with the words, "Everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country, directly or through freely chosen representatives." This is not stated as an aspiration. It is a right. Human rights are not privileges that are given to people or withheld from people, depending on the government. Human rights are guaranteed to all people, regardless of where they live. But rights must be protected, and at times they must be fought for. Even in stable democracies, we can see that erosion in one area of human rights can lead to erosions in other areas. The United States played a pivotal role in the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And while the U.S. record on the human rights treaties that have arisen from the Declaration is a spotty one, and far from pristine, the U.S. has at times played a role in creating a stronger environment for global adherence to a human rights standard. When following the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. government began to promote a more conditional approach to human rights, it set the U.S. on a deeply troubling course that continues today, where the government of Ronald Reagan affirmed U.S. opposition to torture when it signed the UN Convention Against Torture in 1988. The government of George W. Bush undermined that position by seeking to torture detainees beyond the reach of the U.S. courts and seeking to recast the very definition of torture. This was done under the aegis of national security, and it was accompanied by deep intrusions into the privacy and the rights of Americans. Some of these intrusions were spelled out in law, as we saw in the Patriot Act. Others were less obvious. But in time, we've come to realize the extent to which, or we think we realize, the extent to which the U.S. government has spied on vast numbers of Americans and non-Americans in the name of national security. The job of human rights activists is to focus on the practical implementation of human rights protection, regardless of what may be proclaimed at the level of national policy. When governments claim that they have the right to read correspondence of peaceful political opponents or civil society activists, should we be concerned? What do such actions tell us about a government's overall approach to human rights? What glimpses of a possible future do such actions bring us? And do we think that that's a future in which democracy will thrive? The protection of human rights requires vigilance and determination. Amnesty International was founded 53 years ago in the belief that the ordinary individual had a role and indeed an obligation to play in upholding human rights around the world. Protecting human rights, I believe, is too important to leave only to governments.
No, thank you for that important reminder that sort of democracy is defined outside of the context of, the governments who actually claim that label, and that voting alone is not sufficient for claiming, enforcing, and respecting the democratic process or democracy itself. Ms. Tucker, Professor Tucker, can you talk about how this particular issue, plays out in your particular area of work?
Thank you. I'd be happy to. Good afternoon, everybody. I am here as a very vigorous advocate of a free press, and that term is probably a bit dated, so a free and active news media. I believe very strongly that having unfettered free news media contributes to a strong and vital democracy. I have spent more than 30 years in journalism because I believe that to be true. I want to start by talking about some of the things that I think have constrained the press a bit, the news media a bit here in the United States. Generally, as Americans, we are pleased to think of ourselves as having a very free and active news media. And generally, in comparison to other countries, that's true. But an organization called Reporters Without Borders ranks, I believe, 180 countries on whether or not they have free news media. And the United States, in their 2014 ranking, suffered a rather precipitous drop from, I believe, 32nd to 46th. And that new ranking, new lower ranking, has everything to do with the way the Obama administration has pursued not just people employed by the government who have leaked classified information, but have also entangled journalists in its pursuit of people who have leaked classified information. Some of this interest in protecting more and more information and pursuing leakers started after 9/11 in the administration of George W. Bush. While President Obama, as Michael just said, stopped the practice of torture, or at least says he did, and insofar as we know, he did, he continued many of the practices of the Bush administration around secrecy and access to information. And in the classes I teach at UGA, I tell my students that we are going to talk separately about the actions of the leakers, whether Bradley Manning or Edward Snowden, and the actions of the journalists. I believe the government has every right to pursue people with classified clearances who violate the law. But I also believe that it is imperative that journalists not only are allowed to publish that information once they have it, but that they are encouraged by the public, by the citizenry, when they do so. I believe that it is important for you to know how much information that the NSA was gathering. I believe that you should be concerned that the NSA had such a wide dragnet of information on citizens of the United States. I believe that it should concern Democrats large d and Democrats small d, that those practices were continued in the Obama administration. I believe that most of the journalists who handled this information handled it wisely and sensitively. In fact, the Washington Post was just awarded a Pulitzer Prize for its news stories following the information that they got from Edward Snowden. That was certainly important to me, that my profession recognized how important it was for journalists to continue to let citizens know what the government is doing in your name, no matter how controversial that may be. Benjamin Franklin said famously, any people who would sacrifice liberty for security deserve neither. I think that is very much worth thinking about in the post-9/11 world in which we live. How much of our liberty we are willing to trade in the name of security. There have been senators serving on the Senate Intelligence Committee who have said for years that they did not believe that this NSA program was vital to stopping terrorist attacks. But because they were constrained, they couldn't tell the public very much about what they knew. But journalists who got information from Edward Snowden were able to bring us much more of that information. And I think our democracy is healthier for those disclosures. One of the things that concerns me about the way the Obama administration has proceeded is when it has pursued leakers, it has used journalists to do so. They got phone records from the Associated Press without any warning as they were pursuing a leaker who gave the Associated Press classified information. The first thing I would say is that the Obama administration and previous administrations have classified far too much information. I don't think they have any good reason for keeping as much of that secret as they have. The other thing I would say is to reiterate what a couple of members of the Senate Intelligence Committee have said, and that is, as it does not appear that much of this NSA snooping and spying on American citizens has thwarted attacks on American soil. And I think that's important for citizens to know. However, having talked about the things that concern me about what's going on in the United States at the moment, it's also important for me to say, yes, our news media and the protections we are afforded contrast very favorably to what goes on in many other countries around the world. Our moderator, Dr. Tomlinson, asked us earlier to be sure that we give our definition of democracy. So that the audience would know what we're talking about, and that we're all on the same page. And I'm glad Michael said what he did about there being no working definition, because I'm not sure I could give you mine. I think my definition of democracy is much like the Supreme Court's famous definition of pornography. I know it when I see it. I would tell you, however, that any country in which most news media outlets are state-controlled is probably not going to meet my definition of a vital, high-functioning democracy. So let me contrast the things I just criticized the Obama administration for to what's going on in Russia at the moment. In Russia, most of the major news media organizations are state-controlled. Since 1993, 80 journalists have been killed in Russia, which is one of the ways that the state and its agents control the news media. In 24 of those cases, we are not sure that reporters were killed because of stories that they were working on. But in 56 of those cases, it's clear, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, that they were killed because of news stories they were working on. Those stories didn't always relate to the government per se. Sometimes those stories related to huge business operations, which may have been corrupt. So Russia clearly is not a safe place for journalists to work. That atmosphere is one of the ways in which Putin gets away with telling his citizens things about the Ukraine that are simply not true. He has persuaded his citizenry through state-controlled media, for example, that Russian-speaking citizens in the Ukraine are in danger. Independent actors, people, journalists and observers who have been there say they can find little evidence of that. I don't believe that Russia will have a high-functioning democracy, something that I would recognize as a democracy, as long as most of its major news outlets are state-controlled and its environment is dangerous for journalists to work in.
Thank you. And I would like to return when we get to sort of interactive conversation about this really interesting distinction you've made between the government's right to pursue leakers with classified access, as well as sort of the distinction between the journalists who then use that information. I think a healthy conversation has started between you and David that I would hope to rehash again for all of our sake. And so, David, you come to the issue of the press from a slightly different angle. So can you talk a bit about how, within that role,
Yeah. So I would say that my job is to make sure that people like Cynthia get to do her job.
Very true.
And, to start out, democracy, to me, what is a democratic government? Ultimately is a government that exists by virtue of the consent of the people it governs. And absent that, it lacks legitimacy. And, that's what we have, and that's the thing that I always talk about when we're talking about the importance of free speech. How can you suitably make sure your government is expressing your will if you don't participate in it? I think a free press is maybe the single most important ingredient of democracy. And it's the most powerful assurance of integrity and accountability in government, because the truth of the matter is we just can't help ourselves when we get a little bit of power. It's been proven time and time again. That's why we have the law, that's why we have the Constitution, but it's also why we have the press, because humans by their very nature are going to choose to do things to preserve their power and authority. Sometimes the simple fact of knowing creates change. And I'll give you two really good examples. One was something we did back in 2004. You may recall in the 2000 election, there was a lot of controversy about the role of, the list of convicted felons in Florida who were going to be prohibited from voting, because Florida is one state where if you're a convicted felon, you can no longer vote. We filed a lawsuit. We had to have a Florida law declared unconstitutional in 2004. We were successful, and requiring the release of the list for that year. There were 47,000 names on the list. Of the 47,000 names on the list, 22 had Hispanic surnames. Not 22,000, I mean 10 plus 12. In a state that has a massive Cuban-American population that votes overwhelmingly Republican, with a Republican governor and a Republican Secretary of State. These were to be sent off to all the local election boards, who would then be faced with the burden of trying to investigate each and every of these 47,000 claims. The simple fact of that reporting got that list eliminated, faced with the embarrassment of what that report actually showed. Similarly, we spent the past 2 years on CNN International doing something called the Freedom Project, which is to pull the curtain back on the awfulness of sex slavery and the sex trade around the world. It's resulted in hundreds upon hundreds of arrests, breakup of crime rings, and frankly is one of our prouder moments of my time there. This is knowledge that makes change. The exposure, what do they say, sunlight is the best disinfectant. I believe that. These things all, though, to me work together. In the core is this promise of democracy and free speech, free press, voting, human rights. Those are all ways that we make sure that those in power keep their promise, keep the promise of representation, keep the promise of human rights, keep the promise of integrity. And without that, it tends to fall apart. Part of the discussion that Cynthia and I were having beforehand was I actually disagree with the Reporters Without Borders study, based on my own experience of handling lawsuits and legal claims in over 30 different countries. And what I would say is, by an order of magnitude, the ability to publish in the United States is far freer than anywhere else in the world. Now, here's the asterisk. What's been under assault is the ability of reporters to report. And so, while you can publish anything you have, what you get is being compromised. So that's, I think, where we agree. And it's been no better, sadly, under the Obama administration, despite the promises. There have been more prosecutions under the Espionage Act under this president than in the entire history of the law from 1917 until 2008. I personally went to Washington to meet with Attorney General Holder, along with my colleagues from the New York Times and CBS and the AP and Fox. And I made that remark. He said, well, it's only been 6. I said, yeah, but it took us 90 years to get the first 6. Thankfully, I hope, some new guidelines have come out from the Department of Justice to make reporters' jobs easier. But I can't begin to articulate for you the chilling effect that the fear of going to jail for giving up your source, the fear of being accused of yourself engaging in criminal activity, inhibits a journalist from even exploring certain stories. And it's a heavy hand the government has. And unless you've been on the other side of a threat from the FBI or anyone like that, you just don't know what it feels like. And so I do proudly spend a lot of my time pushing against that. Cynthia, I believe it was you said, what the government is doing in our name. And that goes right back to that notion of sovereignty and the government as being an instrument of the people and existing only because the people give it permission to exist. What that really means, though, is everything the government does, they're doing in your name. Everything. If the government is putting people to death in your name, if the government is torturing people in your name, if the government is defending people in your name, don't you want to have a say? Why would you not vote in a system where your fingerprint is on everything the government does? Because that's the way our system is set up. I can't imagine why, given that responsibility, everyone wouldn't want to vote. So I'll close by saying, comparatively, the law reflects the values of any given society. One of the things that's interesting, for example, in Europe versus the United States, you can report a true fact about someone in Europe but still be sued for a species of defamation because of what's called honor. I always say America's a great country. We have no privacy. We have no honor. Makes it a lot easier for press. But Gerhard Schroeder, who was the Chancellor of Germany, successfully sued a major German magazine for publishing a story that he dyed his hair, which was in fact true, but it besmirched his honor. It wasn't considered important for the public to know. So those are the kind of things we have to navigate throughout the world. In Thailand, it's illegal to criticize the king. In Egypt, you can defame a dead person. And we at CNN and any national, multinational news organization are fighting against this race to the bottom, where we're forced to comply with those laws that are less favorable for free speech. But ultimately, the question is, do we value our own free press? While our laws reflect our values, do we value our own media? Do we value our own press? And that's where I'm actually the most troubled. We had some stories come out this year that underscore the absolute critical value that a local media plays in the public debate in this country. No one would have ever known about the New Jersey Bridge scandal if it weren't for the Newark Star-Ledger, which just had massive newsroom layoffs. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution is regularly publishing excellent articles because they're doing great shoe-leather journalism, filing FOIA requests, going through all these documents for you. But it's a two-way street. If we don't value it, we will lose it. Not because someone will steal it from us, but because we won't care enough to notice it's being taken away right under our noses.
No, thank you. So for this next portion, I want you all to engage in sort of a cross-dialogue on this next question about an example of a context where democracy was weakened or failed because of lack of freedom of the press, human rights, or voting rights. And if you're not talking about the US, then do you see similar emerging practices here? So anyone can begin with that one.
Well, I'd like to jump in if I can.
Please.
And pick up actually on a country that Cynthia mentioned, and that would be Russia. And I think that Russia is a good example. Cynthia did a very good job of laying out the dangers that journalists face in Russia. It's been now...
Is that an electrical storm coming?
Yeah.
Is
Or
Putin?
the NSA's.
Yeah, the NSA. It's now been 8 years since the courageous journalist Anna Politkovskaya was murdered in Russia for her work, murdered on Vladimir Putin's birthday. It just so happened. And the world is no closer to finding out who was behind her murder than we were 8 years ago. But journalists are part of the picture, and I think that we also I just want to mention the broader threats to civil society at play in Russia, which undermine the foundations of anything aspiring to be a democratic society. Russia has, under Vladimir Putin, who has been in power now for 14 years. He was first president of Russia. He then became prime minister and then became president again, altering the constitution in the midst in order to allow that to happen. And during this time, and particularly since he's come back into power, there's been a precipitous drop in the, or I should say an escalation in the threat to human rights. Non-governmental organizations, NGOs, civil society organizations in Russia have found themselves having to conform to a range of new laws that have been designed, it seems, expressly to make it difficult for them to exist. And a number of organizations have actually had to close their doors because they could not comply with the laws that the government set in place. The government has passed laws that invoke massive fines, impose massive fines upon individuals who participate, and particularly upon individuals who orchestrate protests, peaceful protests. These are the underpinnings of a democratic society, the ability to speak one's mind in a peaceful manner. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the ability to associate and assemble freely are critical elements of a democratic society. And we're seeing now with Russia that all of those are under assault. And I found it very interesting, I guess just to bring it full circle to the United States. You know, Russia's often, people talk about the oligarchs. And there was a study that just came out recently that pointed to the United States and analyzed the United States and said that what the United States has is not, in fact, a democracy, it is an oligarchy. So I will stop there.
What a note.
I think with Russia, you know, this has been a long executed plan. You know, part of Vladimir Putin's effort to consolidate his power. Where did he start first? He started by shutting down the free media during his first term, and then obviously sort of this reign of terror against journalism. You know, I think in our own country, I have to say I'm exceedingly troubled by so many efforts at the state level to make it harder for people to vote instead of easier, for some sort of short-term political advantage. One of the things, a really interesting article in today's New York Times was talking about midterm elections and how few swing voters there really are. People aren't changing. It's just who shows up. It's all about turnout. So we get in this turnout game on both sides. How can you game the turnout? Because that's going to drive election victory as much as anything else. And I think it's a very short-sighted, cynical perversion of democracy to do that to people in a time when we can, without leaving our chair, you know, buy books, you know, do your banking, you know, write a book, but you can't vote without, you know, some old-fashioned. This will not end well for either political party. And it's a game they both play. It's as old as gerrymandering. But this is the latest phase that really troubles me.
Thank you. Cynthia or Sarah?
First, I'd just like to briefly reiterate the point that David just made about what's going on with voting, because I think that for, you know, middle-class folks who drive every day, who can't imagine life without a driver's license, it's easy to overlook what's going on there. I spent Easter Sunday in the church I grew up in, a town you never heard of in Alabama, 7,000 people. Many of the members of my mom's church, elderly people who don't own cars, have never driven, will never get on an airplane, don't want to. But everybody in town knows who they are. But they've been going to the same polling place for 60 or 70 years. And so this insistence that they have a photo ID to vote is just a way to set up a barrier to voting. Having said that, let me switch, since my area of expertise here is the news media, let me talk about that briefly. And instead of answering your question, Yolande, I'm going to turn it on its head and talk about a place where I believe a vigorous and free press has contributed to the growth, a growing and vibrant democracy, and that's South Africa. South Africa, God knows, still has a whole lot of problems. But one of the things that I believe has gone right there in the last 15 years has been the growth of its free press. Now, South Africa never really had closed news media. What it had was more like the United States had in the days before desegregation. It had a white press, a black press, and a brown press. And they didn't cover each other's communities very well. And of course, the white press covered the apartheid government as if there was absolutely nothing wrong with that. But there have been many organizations, some from the US, some from Europe, that went into South Africa starting 30 years ago or so to help train their journalists for a post-apartheid society. I remember hearing a black South African journalist say they had no idea how to cover a real democratic government, because they hadn't had one of those in his lifetime. So I think that one of the things that has gone right in South Africa is the vigorous free press that they have, and I think that it will help them as they try to cope with the other things that they have going on there.
Well, now you turn it around.
Thank you. Just a few observations, I guess, in terms of the Carter Center's work in other countries, and just to give you an idea of some of the issues that we do look at that could be, that I think are a little bit unusual compared to the United States. And some of, for example, in our recent observations in Tunisia over the last few years, since the Arab revolutions, some of the questions that we've been looking at there in terms of candidacy rights and who has the ability to run as a candidate in an election. Should everyone be able to run? Should former officials from the former regime be barred from running? If some people are barred from running because they decide that those people may have a negative impact for the establishment of a democratic transition or a democratic governance, who decides which people should be barred, and what sort of laws should be enacted, what sort of lustration laws should be enacted, and what sort of committee or authority should be deciding who meets those criteria or not. Some unusual things that we haven't had to consider here in the US. Another one concerning voter registration and the debate here in the United States about having a voter ID and a picture ID. Very frequently, it is true that in many of the former Soviet Union countries in the Balkans, where they have, over the last several years or few decades, rewritten their electoral legislation, have included stipulations that you need to have a photo ID. And very often, as an observer in these countries, I would very regularly watch to see whether or not the polling officials were checking a person's ID against a list, and whether or not they would be dinged if they weren't following that regulation. But here in the United States, looking back to see what sort of impact that might have, how do you give voter registration or voter IDs to people in such a way that it does not have a negative impact on certain segments of the population, that they're able to actually do that without having an economic cost to missing work or having to pay for a government-issued ID. In some places that we work, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire, many people, because of the Civil War, don't even have papers. They don't have a birth certificate, or they're not able to prove who they are, or that even their citizenship in a country. And so for several months, we observed a voter registration process in which members of the tribe came forward to vouch for those people as representative or as members and as citizens of Cote d'Ivoire. And it's worth asking the question if maybe we can think about measures here in the United States that might provide for alternative means of vouching for someone as opposed to showing a photo ID, or if there's other steps that could be taken to meet that same goal, the way that they do in other countries.
No, so thank you all. I think now we're going to open up to hear from the audience. I see a hand up in the back. And we're going to engage in some question and answer with the panel for about 10-15 minutes.
Hello, I'm Rita Hansen. I'd like to kind of get a unique perspective from this very unique panel that we have on the issue of how technology is impacting our democracy. And let me give you a couple of contexts. Professor Tucker talked about her family in Alabama. On the other side, I've worked election protection, nonpartisan, for maybe the last decade or so, and I would get these desperate calls from students who didn't understand why they just couldn't go to any polling place to vote, like you vote at an ATM. And it kind of made sense to me where there is a centralized voting system in Georgia, and all of us working election protection, the only place we really went to check anybody's credentials really was the Secretary of State's website. So if there's a central location that you can go online to, why can't you just go and vote like at an ATM? You don't have to show any ID. Maybe there's a system for showing ID if you have to. But again, that's another context. The other thing is, Mr. Vigilante, right, said something about how many people have been prosecuted under President Obama. But we never before had the technology that allowed anyone with a minor education to crack a computer system. We used to need our kids to program our VCRs, but now anybody can crack a computer system. And personally, I'd rather my voter records be cracked than my bank accounts. But again, the technologies have changed a lot of the way we get news, make news. Anybody can have a blog and seem reasonable to somebody. So those are two contexts that I'm giving you. The actual voting process and the news making, receiving, writing process.
I think we can bank electronically. I can pay my taxes to the same government I'm voting for electronically. You know, all of this, you know, we have a voting system that was designed to serve the needs of the populace, you know, 100 years ago and more. You know, whether that comes to pass, I don't know. With respect to the prosecutions I was talking about, those weren't really dependent on technology. These were just ordinary leaks. And shoehorning journalists into the leak investigations to the point of actually implicating a journalist under the Espionage Act, which had never been done before. You know, and I know when we met with the Attorney General, he looked like his dog just died, because I don't think this is what he wants his legacy to be. And they were very open to ideas, et cetera, et cetera. I think this is the danger you have when you create any kind of framework in any kind of government that doesn't have a transparent outward accountability. So you have secret courts and secret proceedings, and these things, sometimes through no ill will, just spin out of control and create and become ecosystems of their own, which all the more underscores the need for legal access to these kind of things, and laws that ensure the press is going to get access and that its interests are going to be taken into account.
Good afternoon. My name is Anthony Showell. I'm a student at John Marshall. I have a question about the new technological environment that we have with a lot of the blogging. My question is, historically, freedom of speech in the news medium is something that's been protected, which I agree with, but with the new ways that you can disseminate information about people, I wanted to know how you felt about defamation and blogging and different things that can be disseminated quickly throughout the internet.
You know, bloggers are a lot closer to what the Founding Fathers had in mind when they drafted the First Amendment. You know, the lonely pamphleteer and the way that news was disseminated back then. They're certainly closer to it than the mass corporations that do it, like my own, candidly. And so I don't think that they are entitled to less protection, but I also think they're entitled to the same consequences. I'm always startled when people are surprised. I didn't know you could get a defamation claim from Twitter. Yeah, you know, you did it. You said it. It was false and it was wrong, and you hurt somebody's reputation. And that's what the law provides. So the law applies regardless of your method of publication, and that's, you know, good and bad. I would take that, and this is really comes to my earlier point about, I'll take that wide open speech over more restrictive press laws, even in countries you wouldn't imagine, like the United Kingdom and in continental Europe, that are far more difficult for the non-professional journalists.
Anyone else want to comment? You don't have to. Look, go ahead.
I would add just one point, and that the human rights framework also incorporates into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. One of the last articles of the Declaration says that none of the above articles allows you to trump the rights of others. And that's the basic underpinning. So that, yes, there is a right to freedom of expression, but there is a limit that can be placed on freedom of expression if that then can lead to the denial of someone's rights in another area. And it's a tricky proposition for sure. But I think that it's, it goes back to the common sense understanding of that no one has the right to cry fire in a crowded theater. This is the human rights context of that.
No, thank you. We'll take a couple more questions and then get some final comments from the panel.
We have some elections going on right here in Georgia. One of them is very contentious, the U.S. Senate race. What I have seen and what I've experienced is that there's been some suppression in the press from where there are other candidates who did not get the same access as certain candidates in the press. Now, where that comes from and where that originates, is it I see a form of suppression, but it's kind of an issue as to where it's originating from. Who makes the decisions as far as the newsroom? What is newsworthy? Because to me, it subverts democracy when you have candidates who do not get the same access as the other candidates who are able to get more because of their name or their political connections. They seem to have a better relationship with the press. And it's been very interesting to see what has gone on where that democracy really has not been promoted in Georgia, because we say anyone can run, but there comes with an asterisk because you have to have certain, you have to have X amount of money, this and that. So I don't really see democracy taking place here. And this also leads to my other question about the Princeton report that was mentioned earlier, that said that we're not really a democracy, we're an oligarchy, and that there was also a study, part of that study included that citizens who went to redress their elected officials barely got, or it didn't register with elected officials. Who they listened to were the people who donated to their campaigns or who were a member of the oligarchy class. So I kind of have a problem with the whole issue of democracy. What we want it to look like and what it actually is two different applications. So that's for anybody out there.
It is absolutely true that news organizations make decisions every single day about what they believe is more newsworthy, and candidates deemed to be major candidates are going to get more attention. I don't think that that's going to change anytime soon. In major news organizations, I think they actually have some guidelines they use about who's a major candidate. And yes, one of those guidelines is how much money that person has raised, because we all know in our system, money talks. That's just a reality on the ground. I would love to have a system of publicly funded elections, but that's not what we got. However, having said that, I think one of the beauties of the age of all of these new technologies, including blogs, is that lesser candidates have a much easier time getting their message out on their own. Anybody can start his or her own web page. Anybody can tweet. And just as social media have helped to launch movements abroad, they can also and have launched movements in this country and can help to launch candidates who are not on an equal footing with the legacy media. So if you know a candidate who isn't getting as much attention as you think he or she should, tell them to start tweeting.
So this is actually something I deal with directly as part of my job, and that is when we're hosting presidential debates, particularly in the primaries. Who do you invite? You know, the law requires that we have a set of objective criteria that would apply to all candidates, and typically early on it's very low. You know, are you getting 1% in the polls? You know, and then we'll raise that as the thing progresses. You know, if you can't get 1% in a poll of 1,000 people, I mean, you're not. You know, and at some point it's a competition. And you have to be able to compete your way in to earn a place at the podium, so to speak. You know, but we're not in the business of being kingmakers. We're covering the story. And, you know, this last election cycle on the Republican side, just as a candidate was left for dead if he didn't win the next primary. You know, so, you know, you want to be careful about that, obviously. But I agree with Cynthia. There's a democratization that's going on because of social media. And people have alternative ways to get their message out for a lot less money than in the past, and it's going to be fascinating to watch how that impacts our debate and discussion.
No, thank you each. And in the interest of time, I'm going to give each panelist about 30 seconds to leave us with a final thought about what can, you know, we as audience, fairly educated folks, do to ensure that our rights to an equal and fair democracy are protected or enforced, or that we reclaim them. So we'll start backwards by starting with David.
Okay, I'll be quick. Demand more from your media and vote.
Amen to that. And I would ask you as citizens to think about the trade-offs that we have made between security and liberty and whether those are even necessary.
Show up, be present, right? History is made by those who show up. I would encourage you all to, you know, have a voice, use your voice, not just for the rights of those here, but for the rights of those around the world. And certainly if you become involved with Amnesty International, there are many ways that we can help amplify your voice. And Dina has pamphlets for Amnesty International. Thank you.
I think I'm outplugged on that one. However, I can only reemphasize the show up and participate, but even being here and listening to the panel, I think, is giving a greater awareness to what it is that we do look at in terms of the fundamentals of a democratic society, what is important, thinking about the different ways in which our own society does or does not meet international standards for political and civil participation. And if you'd like to find more information about the U.S. treaty obligations, or any other country for that matter, we do have a database on the Carter Center website that will give you a full listing of the international treaties that cover political and civil rights and elections, and it can give you a little more information. And I would just encourage you also to get involved as a poll watcher, an observer here in the U.S. It's always needed and always appreciated. Thanks.
And while I'm not an official panel, I'll take a 10 seconds to say, with respect to human rights, recognizing that the democratic process goes beyond your civil and political rights, and it also impacts those economic, social, cultural rights. So I started off, for example, talking about how access to health care or food or education impacts your ability to fully participate in the democratic process. And that's also work the U.S. Human Rights Network does. And visiting our site, talking to me, give you more access to that information. So join me in giving our panelists a hand for the excellent job today.
Well, that was amazing, and I want to thank all of our panelists, our moderator, Dr. Tomlinson, Sarah Johnson, Michael O'Reilly, Cynthia Tucker, and David Vigilante. One of the things that our group wanted to do to recognize all of our panelists today is to do something a little special for them. And since the National Center for Civil and Human Rights is our partner in this program, our Law Day Committee has purchased for each of these folks who've participated on the panel this afternoon a tile at the new National Center for each of them. So